For the bulk of my career, the way that I've ended a week to unwind and just kind of get lost for a few hours is to pour myself a drink, pour my wife a drink, sit out on the patio and read old manuscripts on brewing, distilling, malting, and anything to do with my field, and just get lost in the history of these old production methods. It's just fascinating ways of making whiskey and beer and malt in those days. And when social media came along, I would post about these readings. I called them my 14th floor readings, so that my nephews could see, really how much work goes into my trade and owning a small business, and that you have to keep working at it. It's in these readings that I came across the Crampton and Tolman paper about 15 years ago, and that's what started the whole adventure. Our attention turned to just before the turn of the century, the turn of the last century, and we looked at the Bottled and Bond Act. Bottled and Bond Act was passed in 1897. It was basically America's first consumer protection law. And what it looked to do is protect the distillers from counterfeit production of whiskey. So the producers would add all manner of things to the whiskey and call it whiskey. And the distillers had enough and went to Washington and drafted the Bottled and Bond Act that protected the integrity of the whiskey so that a consumer knew when they were buying whiskey, they'd actually get whiskey. Right after the Bottled and Bond Act was signed into law, the IRS commissioned researchers to do surveys of American distilleries to try and decide, okay, what makes bourbon, bourbon? What makes rye, rye? And this was called the Crampton and Tolman paper. And when I came across that, I realized that all of my hard work and reading paid off, because I came across what's essentially the blueprint for how whiskey was made in the late 1800s. So the Crampton and Tolman paper starts like this: a study of the changes taking place in whiskey stored in wood by Crampton and Tolman. This investigation was planned and begun by Crampton and Tolman in the laboratory of the Bureau of Internal Revenue in 1898 in order to obtain more definite information concerning the changes taking place in whiskey and stored in wood in connection with internal revenue laws relating to the bonding of distilled spirits and the sale of same under government stamp. The experiment was conducted with the cooperation of a large number of whiskey distillers who furnished the material, which was placed in bonded warehouses under the supervision of the U.S. storekeepers. 31 barrels of new spirits were set aside at that time in as many different warehouses from as many different distilleries, and a quart sample from each barrel was taken for analysis and sent to the laboratory. So this is just coming off of the Bottled and Bond Act of 1897. And the government was looking to put together what makes whiskey whiskey, what makes rye whiskey, in particular rye whiskey in America, what makes American bourbon. This is what would later be called the standards of identity, the rules that you have to follow as a distiller to produce your spirits. Crampton and Tolman looked at 31 different distilleries, and roughly half of them made rye whiskey. And what they did was they did a complete breakdown of these rye whiskey producers and looked at their production methods. So what kind of still did they use? How big was it? What was their grist recipe? How much rye did they use? How much barley did they use? Did they add any corn? What was their entry proof? And as I started to look into it, I realized that every single one of the rye producers, except for one, used what they called a chamber still, or a 3-chamber still. And I thought that was unusual. I'd never heard of a chamber still before. And that's what really sent me down the rabbit hole on this, to find out what's a chamber still and why are all of these distillers using it almost exclusively. It was clearly the tool of choice for whiskey distillers before Prohibition. Further research led me to trade magazines that were published in the 1930s. One of them was put together by the Chemical and Metallurgical Society, and essentially it was a book of flow sheets that showed how to make everything from creosote to sodium hydroxide. But I found a gem called The World's Largest Distillery Nears Completion. It was an article put together by Mr. Cooley from the Hiram Walker plant. And it was a description of, at the time, what was the largest distillery in the entire world, and it was capable of producing 100,000 gallons of whiskey per day. It's just mind-boggling, but this is left over from the Gilded Age when we had vertical integration and you just made massive quantities of everything, and this was with that mindset. But what fascinated me was when I came across a distillery flow sheet and I realized that they had 2 continuous stills and a 3-chamber still. And if you're trying to make 100,000 gallons of whiskey a day, using a batch still, a 3-chamber still, doesn't make a whole lot of sense. To me, this was an enormous clue as to the 3-chamber still producing a whiskey that was entirely different and that couldn't be replicated. Because why would you install 2 continuous stills and not just a 3rd or a 4th if the whiskey didn't taste entirely different coming off of a 3-chamber still? So that was it. That told me, okay, if the historical distillery, the size of a Hiram Walker plant in Peoria, Illinois, wanted to put in a 3-chamber still, it had to be because the whiskey was entirely different. And it had to be so different that the average consumer could tell the difference. Once I gained that understanding, I went to my brother Scott and said, okay, I think I understand how this still works. And we need to put in a call to Vendome and see if they'll fabricate it for us. Found that the best way to explain how the 3-chamber still operates is to consider that you just finished collecting the heads, hearts, and tails from the last batch. So the fermented mash is in chamber number 3. It's now been exhausted of alcohol from the last run, and what we're gonna do is pump that out, and that's stillage at that point, which is essentially animal feed that we give to a local farmer. And now chamber number 3 is empty. So then we're gonna open the valve at the bottom of chamber number 2, and the mash that's in chamber number 2 is gonna flow down into chamber number 3 by gravity, and then we're gonna close the valve and open the valve at the bottom of chamber number 1, and the mash that's in chamber number 1 is now going to flow into the now emptied chamber number 2, and that's gonna fill. And then we're gonna close the valve, and then we'll open the valve between the preheater and chamber number 1 and let the mash that's sitting in the preheater that has a full alcoholic strength is gonna flow down into chamber number 1. We're gonna close that, and then we're going to pump a little bit more mash in to fill the preheater out of what's called a beer well. And the beer well is just basically a surge tank that's topped off by all the fermenters that we have, the open wooden fermenters that we use to ferment out the 80% rye, 20% floor malt mash that we do. So now that all 4 of the chambers are filled, and now we're gonna open up the steam valve, and the steam is going to be directed through the bottom of the still. It's gonna enter through chamber number 3. It's gonna go up through that center post, go through chamber number 2, bubble up through that mash. It's gonna go through the center post above it. It's gonna flow through the mash in chamber number 1. And the vapor doesn't actually enter the preheater chamber. It's just going through a heat exchanger, and the idea behind it is you're warming up the mash that's sitting in the preheater that just came out of the beer well at room temperature so that it's just about at boiling when you're ready for the next batch. The vapor path is going to continue through that heat exchanger in the preheater, and then it's off to a thumper and then a condenser where it's going to hit a column filled with cool water, and the hot vapor is going to hit a very cooled surface. It's going to condense and come out as alcohol. It's that alcohol that we're going to take our head, heart, and tail cuts, and the heart cut is what we're going to wind up diluting with water and putting down into a number 4 char barrel. Now, from a practical standpoint, the way that the 3-chamber still creates a distillate that's completely different is that bottom chamber. That bottom chamber where the steam enters, it has about 10 feet of mash above it, and that increases the pressure. The pressure goes up about 4 psi. That increased pressure increases the temperature. So continuous still usually operates The hottest point is usually around 198 degrees for most of the beer columns that you see all over distilleries in America, the larger ones in particular. But the 3 chambers still, that added pressure and the fact that that bottom chamber, the mash that's in there at the start almost has no alcohol at all. So it's almost water. So it pushes the temperature up really north of 210 degrees and all the way up to 220. And what that does is it starts to extract different compounds. It extracts compounds that are more water soluble that start to come out. And what that means are oils, basically. And so it's pulling all of this oil out of that mash on the way to the condenser, which obviously is what makes it heavy-bodied whiskey and that beautiful mouthfeel, but those oils also contain beautiful aromas. And so you get roses and elderflower and all these beautiful notes getting pulled out of that bottom chamber. And that's really what makes the still run. And once I had an understanding of that, then the question became, okay, we need to get to work on the grain bill. What are we going to mash and put into the 3-chamber still? We started our grain program several years ago when we realized that American agriculture had been breeding the flavor out of their beverage alcohol grains for really over 100 years. What I mean by that is that they've been chasing after more and more yield. And yield, when we're talking about making alcohol out of grain, is more starch, more and more starch. So at Crampton and Tolman's time, you can expect to see 60-65% starch out of your rye and out of your barley. And here in 2020, you're looking at north of 80%. So that's a pretty profound change in our plants and in our crops in just 100 years' time. The problem with that is starch doesn't have any flavor. So in pushing to move from that 60% all the way up to 80%, you're getting a very large percentage less flavor because starch doesn't really taste like anything. So as a result, we looked into, okay, well, what were the grains that they were using back in Crampton and Tolman's time? A big one that we came across was rosin rye. Rosin was favored, as far as I could tell, by the Pennsylvania distillers that were so famous for making beautiful rye whiskeys back in those days. And another was a Abruzzi rye. And a Abruzzi rye was brought over from Italy. And when I reached out to a seed bank to get a sample and sent it out for analysis, I found that the starch content was 62%. I thought to myself, okay, now we have something. If it's not 80% and it's all the way down at 62%, what that's also going to mean is, okay, well, what else does it have now that isn't starch? In the case of the Abruzzi, that meant a very high oil content. Rye tends to have somewhere between 0.2 and 4% oil content. Abruzzi's on the high end, and of course, the 3-chamber still is an oil extraction machine. So I wanted to make sure that I could emphasize that as much as possible. So Abruzzi was what we wanted to go with. So we just started with a handful of this grain and had it grown for us about 20 miles down the road. And we have several hundred acres now that have been growing there for well over 5 years. And it makes this beautiful rye that is very rich in oil. And it also has a very high levels of what's called linalool. And linalool, most people will say, reminds them of lavender or flowers or chamomile or elderflower, floral notes essentially. And it had an awful lot of that. In addition to that, the fact that it has that 62% starch, if I'm using the Abruzzi rye versus what I would be using with a modern rye at that 80% starch, in order to make a 5% alcohol mash, I need to add about 30% more with the Abruzzi rye. So you see how this has a multiplying effect. It has more oil, it has more of the lavender and floral notes, and to top it off, to make a 5% beer that I'm going to eventually distill into whiskey, I need to add 30% more of it. So it has this wonderful multiplying effect on the quality of the whiskey. And if we hadn't gotten to the trouble of using the Abruzzi rye, the whiskey would be entirely different. So we're very pleased that after years of research and work and the risk of putting that into the ground, the result is just a beautiful finished whiskey. The other component that's in our mash, of course, is the malted barley, and the malted barley is in there primarily during the mashing process to convert that 80% starch in that grist into simple sugars. So we're adding 20%. That 20%, again, going back to the Crampton and Tolman paper, is what those distillers were using, almost exclusively. Some used a bit less. The reason for that is they didn't have ready access to enzymes. These days you can just buy enzymes out of a jug and dump it into the mash tun, and the enzymes convert the starches into sugars almost instantaneously. Back then you had to mash naturally. And mashing naturally means just mixing the malted barley together with the rye, and the enzymes that's in the malted barley converts the starches into simple sugars. If you're not using enzymes out of a jug, you need to use elevated amounts of that malted barley. In our case, that means our floor malt that we're very proud to make here. And it's going to change the flavor of the whiskey when we're using that elevated amount of malt. So you're going to get honey notes. You're going to get biscuity notes. And a lot of our fans have come to calling our whiskeys malt forward. I like that term an awful lot. But when people like to ask the question, well, what were whiskeys like back then and how have they changed? One of the biggest ones is a lot of the modern distilleries have pulled back on the proportion of malt that they're using, all the way down to 3%. And when we're talking about whiskey, the difference between 3% and 20%, you're completely changing the character of the whiskey. And we think it just makes an absolutely beautiful whiskey having that elevated malt content. Maturation at Leopold Bros focuses on a few simple things. The first of which is a low entry proof. So all our whiskeys go down at 100 proof. This is keeping in line with what I read about in the Crampton and Tolman piece. Every single one of those 31 distilleries put their whiskey down at 100 proof, maybe a smidge higher. The reason for that is it yields a much softer whiskey. Alcohol is a solvent. So the higher the proof you go in, the more you're going to extract compounds out of the wood. And I'm not necessarily interested in that. So we're looking to produce a softer, rounder whiskey. And a nice benefit of that low entry proof is when it comes time to bottle. So with the 3-chamber rye, we're in at 100 proof. And after 4+ years of aging, the proof doesn't change. So we're actually out at 100 proof. So 100 proof is cask strength at Leopold Bros. Another thing that we focus on is evaporation rate. And we control our evaporation rate by using what's called a dunnage style warehouse. And dunnage just refers to the stacking material. They look like wooden ladders that are between the barrels. You'll stack them 3 or 4 barrels high, really, that's about it. The most important component of dunnage style storage is that you're using earthen floors. And the earthen floors are going to release humidity into the air, moisture. And what that moisture does is it slows the evaporation rate out of the barrels, what people call the angel's share. And out here in the West, in the drier states, you can have evaporation rate per year of double digits, 10, 11, 12%. The way that's mitigated by a lot of distilleries is to use a heated warehouse and then, pump water into the air, basically. We handle things sustainably here, and the easier solution is just to leave the earth alone and let it naturally get that moisture up into the air. And as a result of this choice, we're maturing naturally. There's no power in the building. There's an added benefit of being environmentally sustainable. But it's also gotten our evaporation rate down to 4.1% a year, which is basically what you see in most Kentucky and Tennessee warehouses. So we accomplished the goal of getting the evaporation down a bit lower, but it's also making better quality whiskey. So this is a culmination of 15 years of research and work. Everything from learning more about the three-chamber still to designing it and understanding how it works. Like that's the part that I think I probably take the most pride in is understanding why it's different, understanding why it yields a different distillate. Then you add in the decision to put in the Abruzzi rye, drop that in the ground, and what effect that's going to have on the final whiskey. And there's that lavender nose and rose and chamomile that extends into dried fruit and cocoa nibs, and the aroma, it's just, it's remarkable. And then you add the layers of honey you get from the floor malt, with the understanding of how difficult it is to make your own malt and how physical of a job it is and tiring it is. But when you see what it tastes like in that final whiskey, it's just worth it. And the wonderful thing is you don't have to understand how the still works to understand that this is an entirely different kind of whiskey where the grain matters. The barrel isn't dominating the finished whiskey. And that's really something, in my opinion, you got from a lot of whiskeys before Prohibition. And the three-chamber rye whiskey is front and center on that count. So when people ask me what whiskeys were like before Prohibition, well, now you know. And it's remarkable to think that this hasn't been bottled in 5 decades. So this completely disappeared, and what a great point of pride we have in reviving this type of distillation, and how much pride the crew takes in knowing how to run one. And who actually has their hands on the still matters. It's a very tactile still, where how much steam you add and when matters. And the fun thing for me is I'm the late shift, so I get to run this thing every day. And it just has this wonderful, wonderful feeling of pulling the aromas and the flavors out of that mash. It's really indescribable. It's unlike any other still I've run, and I've run quite a few stills in my time. And you can really sense all the different choices that we made, everything from putting the Abruzzi rye into the ground, to expanding our floor malting to get that lovely honeyed note, where that 20% of malted barley really shows up in the glass. And then the entry proof, putting it in at 100. It just makes a much softer whiskey and puts the emphasis on the grain. And you can see the meniscus from the oil. It's so rich in oil. And that's where you get that finish that goes on for days. And I just hope that everybody enjoys drinking it as much as we enjoyed making it, because it was an awful lot of fun. Cheers.